Hello, Ed.
Yeah, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, yeah, there we go. There we go. Looks like, I think that little green box will go away. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Is that pretty bothersome if it doesn't go away?
We're not seeing a green box.
Oh, okay, good. All right. Well, thanks for asking me. I'm glad I've been working with the Camas Groundwater Group for, I guess, about 5 years now. And spent a fair amount of time on the Camas and the Mount Bennett Hills, and glad to share my observations and conclusions that I have if it helps the management committee. I've had a lot of help. Bill Simon, for one, he's long-term resident of Camas Prairie, engineer, scientist, and ardent studier of the hydrologic cycle up there that he depends on for his livelihood. And if you want to know a lot about the science of Camas Prairie, he's a good one to talk to. My mentor, Spencer Wood, and I have spent a lot of days up there on the prairie from his house over in the Wood River Valley and walking around, mapping and other things. And Kurt Newbury, Lauren Pearson, my staff, the people that did the hard work of the monitoring and all the graphing and plotting and statistical analysis. Rusty Kramer, the water master, has been really helpful to us. Dennis Strom, another long-term resident who's helped us use his property and his wells for research. And on the legal side, Charlie Honsinger with Honsinger Law has also been a good asset for us. So didn't want to go very far without acknowledging that it's been a group effort. So my overarching conclusion, and I'm basically just going to share my conclusions with you today. But my overarching conclusion that's, I think, probably the most relevant to this group is that, in my mind, curtailing Camas Prairie groundwater pumpers is not going to result in more water in Magic Reservoir. And that's my conviction. And I'll try to show you why I think that is. You know, there was a credible study by Brian Cler in 1989. And Brian Cler was also a long-term resident of the Camas Prairie. And the estimates that he came up with for recharge, underflow, total volume in the basin are significantly more than what had been previously estimated by other researchers, Walton, Young, and others. And I have to say that I agree with Cler on, I think he did a really good job. And I agree with his estimates, as I will cite a little further down. But I think that the small stream flows that are left in Camas Creek at the lower end during low flow months are not groundwater inflow from the aquifer as discharge. And I think that the 12,000 acre feet average groundwater withdrawal by the Camas Prairie groundwater pumpers is really, really small with comparison to the total volume of water in the basin, and even with respect to the storage in Magic Reservoir. Which fills predominantly from the the main flash of spring runoff from the Big Wood and the Camas Prairie.
Hey, Ed, can
Yeah,
you hear me?
yeah.
Some of the your slide, the last slide anyway, part of it was cut off on the right-hand side, so.
Oh, well, that must be this box that I'm seeing on here. I've never seen that on here before. Because they'll all be cut off, I guess, if that's the case. Yeah, they're all going to be cut off. Not
Okay.
not exactly sure what to do. I could press escape and try to come back. Why don't I do that? Or I'm going to lose a lot of. You're not going to see the presentation. Hang on a second.
Ed, I think you need to hit that button that says enable editing back there. If you hit escape again, I think you need to.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, okay.
Well, I don't think you got it still.
Yeah,
There you go. There you go.
There we go. Yeah, thanks a lot.
thanks, Ed. Perfect.
Okay, so the Cler Reports, I believe, are the best information available. So to date on the hydrogeology of the Camas Basin. You know, both Brian and Kelly, the two brothers, grew up on the Cler Ranch. They were both scientists. They both went on to long scientific careers. They're still involved down south. And I think they were, you know, natural born scientists that were curious about where they lived, spent a young lifetime observing it. And, you know, Brian's 1989 paper was printed, accepted into the Groundwater in 1989. So is really the only peer-reviewed work available on the Camas Prairie. But inexplicably, the reports, the Cler Reports, which there's 4 of them, and 2 are that I use a lot. One is on the geology in the Rift Basin, the Camas Prairie Rift Basin, which they named, and the other is the Hydrogeology report by Brian. Those have been overlooked since I've been around. They're not in any bibliographies. I don't know why that is the case, but I encourage everybody, if they want to read a good report about the Camas Prairie hydrogeology, that'd be the one. And you know, the 2 reports that have been cited a lot are the older reports by Walton and Young. And one of my mentors, E.J. Crossway, was one of Walton's compatriots, one of his colleagues at the GS. And, you know, it always impressed me how much those guys could produce with the little threads of data that they had back in those years. It really was impressive. But at the same time, they didn't have a lot to work with. And I couldn't find a lot of supporting science for Walton's conclusions. And I think a lot of the things that he estimated and projected turned out to be wrong. And I just throw in a couple examples here. The Walton conclusion that the Fairfield LDS well would decline. What Walton was doing was looking at the availability of water in some of the smaller basins, whether there was any more potential for groundwater development. And one of the estimations and calculations he made was if you produced 12,000 acre feet, and he picked that number, which is coincidentally pretty close to the amount that's being pumped out of the basin now, he predicted that the water levels in that well would be 150 feet below ground level from about land surface, which is where it was. in 1962 or 59, whenever it was he measured it. But we've measured that well a few times. And, you know, it hasn't pumped itself all that time, but it is close to the town of Fairfield municipal wells that pump year round. And it's still recovering as we speak, but the last time we measured it about a month ago, it was less than 15 feet below ground level. Cler was also the one who, his intuition was that the Camas Basin was a lot deeper and had a lot more volume to it than Walton envisioned. And in 2018, what was that called? The Play Fairfield, or the Clay Fairway study by a guy named Glenn, did a bunch of geophysics up in the Camas Prairie looking for geothermal water. And they found that Cler was right, that the basin is much, much deeper even than Cler envisioned. And so the volume of groundwater in residence is also a lot bigger. And for Young's work, you know, he went out there, most of the wells got drilled from 73 to 80, most of the irrigation wells, virtually all of them, in the Camas Prairie. And Young went up there during the 1977 drought year, which, as near as I can tell, was the worst drought we've had. And he measured those wells that had been pumping during the drought year. And, you know, I don't think anybody understood in those days that, because the wells were pretty new, that there is a lot of drawdown in those sediments, in those fine-grained aquifers up there. But I don't think that study was overly helpful without the full story. Now, Cler had gone up there and he started out his studies with a water balance, probably because he'd read Walton's water balance. And I never met the man. I don't know what his thoughts were, but he set about doing his own water balance, which he couldn't get to balance very well. So he did his own gravity surveys up there, and of course, he had a lot deeper wells than Walton and Young had to live with. So that's where he came up with his idea about the deep basin. So using Cler's analysis of the basin volume, the Camas groundwater pumping is way small. It's negligible. The total volume of Camas groundwater pumping with respect to Magic Reservoir storage, about 195,000 acre feet, is pretty small as well. 6% of that. This is a cross section from that Glenn study, and they measure the basin in kilometers. So it's pretty deep for a rift basin. One thing that Walton concluded, and I'm not quite sure what he based it on, but in his report, he specifically mentioned that he didn't believe any groundwater left the Camas Basin. I don't believe that, and when I did get a hold of Cler's reports, I found that he didn't believe that. But he believed, based on his gravity surveys, for the most part, that that groundwater, the main bulk of groundwater flowing through the Camas Prairie aquifer, is from northeast to south, or northwest to southeast, toward the Camas Dam area, and just to the west of the Camas Dam area. And that area consists of those of basalt flows, the deeper ones of which are the ones that closed off the Camas Valley and caused the dam to Camas Creek drainage and caused the basin to fill with the sediments and the sands and the clays and everything that serve as the sedimentary aquifers. Well, those same fraction basalts are the basalts of, the Macon Flat, Lone Tree Reservoir, and the area all around Magic Dam, and they're quite thick down there. The Myrtle Basalts, they've been aerially mapped by a number of geologists. Struck-Sacker most recently, and I thought she did a really good job. Spen and I field checked a lot of her measurements up there in 2019. And of course, those basalts have been drilled, and the drillers show thicknesses of hundreds of feet at and around the Magic Dam and below Magic Dam. And they've been described in outcrop, but the drillers also report lots of breaks, fractures, caving interflow zones, and those things all suggest permeability. So I'm at a loss as to why the groundwater moving out of the basin wouldn't go through those basalts, and I believe it does. This is a snapshot of the mapped geology around Magic Dam. This is the Macon basalt over here that's underneath these terrace gravels, goes quite a ways up the Camas Prairie, several miles beyond where it goes under the sediments, in fact. And these basalts are all very close in age. And the Lone Rock Reservoir basalt, Myrtle basalt that surround Magic Dam. This line right here from west to east is a cross section that Spence Wood drew up for me recently, last couple days actually. And that looks like this. Here's Magic Reservoir. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. There's Magic Reservoir. Here's the dam. Here's the dam tender's domestic well, drilled into the Lone Rock Reservoir basalt, underlain by the basalt of Macon. And so you can see they're pretty thick there. And here's the water level in the Marty Bennett well. And so there's water flowing through there. The Macon basalts, and if at those locations it's underlain by other basalts, there are a number of large capacity of several CFS irrigation wells completed into those basalts, most productive wells on the prairie, actually. So that's also another indication that those basalts are permeable. Those are the same basalts that exist at the dam. And when you look closely at the well drillers' reports around the rim and the wells at the dam, and there's a few oddballs over there, geothermal wells, et cetera, but for the most part, the water levels in those wells confirm the depth to groundwater, which is close to, if not at, the base of Magic Reservoir. So I think that surficial water over there is unconfined underneath the dam. And I think those water levels represent the top of the water table as it flows out of the basin there. Another avenue for water to get out of the basin down there is that the silicic volcanic rocks, the rhyolite tuffs, et cetera, Square Mountain andesite, et cetera, at the end of the east end of the Mount Bennett Hills, they're intensely faulted. in the northeast or northwest southeast direction. And so we believe that those down to basin normal faults and the fractured breccia that's in them probably serves as conduits for groundwater flow as well. So we worked pretty hard at this over the years. This is our potentiometric surface map showing the direction and gradient of groundwater flow through Camas Prairie. We had more wells than Walton and Young had, but you always wish you had more. But I think one thing that is pretty conclusive is this, first of all, this main throat of groundwater flow, you know, it's often characterized as east to west. It has a definite southeasterly component in much of the valley. This is Soldier Creek here. It's one of the main drainages, and these kind of mounds here we think are probably due to mounding from inflow through the fans, through the alluvial fans along the mountain front here. This section is a section of flowing artesian wells that still flow today. Back in Walton's time, that area was bigger. These are just some that we noted and measured as part of our monitoring up there. So there may well be more than that. But the overall direction of groundwater flow, once you get down into the basalt section, is from northwest to southeast, right under Magic Reservoir, out through this gap here in the basalts that I'm showing you and telling you about. This is this red line is part of the cross section that we saw. It is the line of section for the cross section we saw. And these are the contours of the water table flowing out of the basin and beyond the basin. So I don't believe that Camas Basin is a closed groundwater basin. I think there's a lot of evidence and hydrologic conditions that demonstrate the water should and does leave the Camas Basin. The potentiometric surface maps we looked at, the water levels in wells, the fractional permeable basalts to transport the underflow, and that they're the same basalts that are known to be permeable to wells and the flows in lower Camas. Then the other thing is that, in my view, the groundwater levels in Camas Prairie are remarkably stable. You know, again, all the wells, all the big irrigation wells were drilled during that 8-year period, 1973 to 1980. So, you know, they've been producing water for 40 years up there. Walton predicted within a year or so that there'd be 150 feet of drawdown. And, you know, the only thing you've really got to go back to there are the measurements of, a few measurements by Walton and Lowe or Young and the well drillers reports. But by and large, especially since the wells that we're measuring in many cases are pumping wells or near pumping wells, there's been very little overall decline in the groundwater table. And the groundwater tables, you know, there's a lot of still flowing artesian wells at land surface, and according to Walton, they were only a few feet above ground level, the artesian pressure heads back in the day when he measured them. We measured water levels in a number of wells that were, 2, 3, 4 feet above ground level just in the last couple of years. And I'll show you an example of the Strom irrigation well that was drilled 38 years ago. Here's a bar graph of when the wells in Camas Prairie were drilled. This was the clump of irrigation wells where the lion's share of them got drilled. And these irrigation wells afterward, many of those are replacement wells. So here's the area of flowing artesian wells still today. Here's the Strom well number 1. Here is irrigation well drilled in 1982. Driller's report is just shown here as recorded as 8 feet below ground level back in 1982. Well, here's the measurement in 2019, right at, if you can barely see it here, here's the last hand measurement that year, but the graph continues up here, and it's right at 8 feet. So it's the same level in 2019 as it was in 1982. And overall, through these years of measurement, the blue line years are years that Hydrogeologic, my company, monitored. And then when IDWR took over our monitoring network of wells, then this is their measurements here. And I'm sure that they go on up to present. But this is adequate to show that over these years that we have measurements for, it has been increasing steadily. It's remarkable how steadily, actually, of 0.44 feet a year. And it's already at or above the level it was in 1982. So groundwater gradients don't lie. And if you believe that surface water streams, i.e. Camas Creek, is declining in flow because of groundwater pumping, graphs like this don't really support that. And the groundwater pumping from Camas Prairie since the measurement district started has been pretty constant, depending on the year, how dry and warm or wet it is. Here's the South Cove well right along the highway. This is Kurt Newbury, and this where he's holding his hand here is 2.5 feet or something like that above the wellhead, and the wellhead's maybe another 2 feet above land surface. Well, that's the artesian head in that well, probably 2016, I'm going to guess. And it's, besides that, it's still leaking because it freezes in the wintertime because you can't shut it off. And there's just a series of wells. This one's flowing at overflowing the casing, couple 3 feet above ground level. I think that's the Frostenson well, I'm not sure. Here's another one. The other thing about the Camas Prairie wells is they're not, when they draw down for pumping, they don't stop recovering during the non-pumping season. They continue to recover until the season starts again. So that means that they're recovering. The groundwater away from the well is higher than it is at the well. So if left alone, they would recover to higher levels. This is that South Cove well I just showed you the picture of. And unfortunately, there's been a long history of measurement of wells in the Camas Prairie and the Big Wood River Valley. But unfortunately, the measurement periods were not very appropriate to help us understand what was going on in the aquifer. And so many years, there were only two measurements, two spot measurements per year. And until this monitoring with the digital data loggers, you really couldn't say when the highs and the lows were. So for those water levels, those decades of water levels that preceded the digital data loggers, it's really difficult to determine how the groundwater was acting. This again is that stream irrigation well, and I've highlighted the recovery period. And in a kind of a backward sense, the blue line is the that's the mean daily discharge from Camas Creek. And it's the other thing that's difficult to see here is that it's not only upside down as far as, you know, higher flows going downward, but it's also logarithmic, because it's really hard to show the extreme variation in stream flows on a linear plot. But what you can see from this is that there are no when the wells turn off for the season, the slow recovery that's very linear and very smooth. There's just no outward indications of these dramatic changes in the creek levels where the Camas surface water users are diverting virtually the entire creek. These big down spikes here, that's the runoff, the flash runoff during the snow melt. And here's the picture that these things just continue to recover relatively rapidly up until the time they get turned on again for the next irrigation season. And probably also of interest is that because magic fills mostly on these high flows, that magic fills when these water wells are off. So groundwater levels are at their highest when magic fills. This is that South Cove well we looked at that had the above ground head of say 5 feet. Well, this South Cove well is not pumped, but this was its replacement. And it's one of the higher producing wells in the valley. It's only about 40 yards away, but this thing still flows artesian even with this thing pumping. This thing flows artesian year round, and this time of year, it's usually a base blob. But other of the monitoring wells are showing the similar, this is 0.7 feet a year, steady rise. This, of course, is a little bit of an aberration here because of the huge water year we had in 2017. The Ixnay well also, this is in the basalt, so there's not a lot of fluctuation, but it's similarly increasing over this period, which means that groundwater in the aquifer, the storage is increasing. And groundwater levels increase year after year. That means the storage in the aquifer is continuing. This was the 95-foot water level from the 1955 report, and we're already, you know, a foot above that in 2019. The McClam well, same thing, that's a foot a year recovery. Strom again, 0.44 feet a year. And here's what I was talking about with respect to the measurements. These are the spot measurements of the past. They go on quite a ways into the past. But now with the digital data log, we're recording every hour or whatever. And so if this was your only measurement this year, you would have missed 4 feet of water level head. That tells you how high it recovered. This year, 3 feet. Here, the low was missed by 13 feet. So it's really difficult to connect these dots. It didn't occur. If you're only going to have a couple measurements a year, they need to be pretty close to the time when the highs and lows occur. And in the Camas Valley, that's difficult to determine. We also think that Camas Creek stream flows are pretty long-term stable. There are flows that go back over 100 years. I think they're all from the Blaine station. And so it's the only data we have. So we regressed that data over 2 time periods, a 90-year period and from 70 to 1920, a 50-year period. And they look like this. Again, trying to plot this linearly, it's a hard graph to follow because the variability in the creek flows is so much. But if you statistically regress all this data back to 1927, you get a downward trend that's about 2.2 acre feet per year over the 190 years, whatever it was. If you do the 50-year trend, you get a 5 acre feet per year. So after 50 years, you're talking about 250 acre feet. Pretty small amount of acre feet. And this is a mathematical construct. As near as I can tell, the general prevailing concept is that the late season flows in Camas and Willow Creek on the lower end of the basin represent, people believe that that represents the main discharge from the Camas Prairie Aquifer. I don't believe that. I don't think the potentiometric surface maps show that. There's, I've only been there a few times, but there's an odd circumstance at the confluence of Willow Creek and Camas Creek that I don't understand hydrogeologically, if that was to be groundwater inflow. And I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone use the surface water term tallweg for the groundwater flow, but I believe that it's not toward that northern part of where Blaine and the Big Wood and the north part of Magic Reservoir. I believe the main flow through the aquifer is toward Magic Dam and just to the west of Magic Dam, where the old outlet was before the rift filled with the basalts. So I think if there were to be any effect from groundwater pumping in the Camas Prairie, I think it would show up over there. And it would be a very small component. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to measure it by comparison, but I think it would show up there and not in the Camas Creek lower drainage. And another thing is that, when Camas drains, it's 100 feet down below the basalt there, below the rim. Well, the Camas aquifer is more constant. I mean, you don't drain an aquifer in a year, a 40-mile long aquifer. So that discharge from the aquifer that's going through the prairie in the sediments, mostly up above, and then it gets into the basalts down there at the lower end, the lower half. Well, those flows are going to be pretty constant year round. And I believe they are, and I think they're, for the most part, going right under Magic Reservoir. So put that a different way, the aquifer doesn't drain like Magic Reservoir. So if there's groundwater inflow coming in to the base of Camas Creek in the Magic Arm, then it sure as heck ought to be coming in through Lava Canyon and the basalt sides of that reservoir as well, and it's not. That's even lower. Another really interesting thing I think, at Magic, and I don't understand it. I haven't been down in Magic, haven't even stood on Magic Dam, haven't called Kevin to see if he would be willing to let me do that. But I have talked to Kevin Lakey about this scenario one time, and it's the fact that there's a spillway in Magic, and even on the most severe drought years, a fair amount of water remains in Magic Reservoir. And I'm not sure why that is. It's probably a combination. But one thought that I have is that may represent, even if it is the spillway level, that may very well represent the water table of the aquifer there. Certainly works out with the potentiometric surface maps. Here's a photo collage of that remaining pool in the drought, late in the year drought years, comparing the pool. It's almost the same every year. And you might make the case, well, what if it's a mud drape on the bottom of the aquifer? What if it's a clay unit under the basalt that's just containing the water? Well, interestingly enough, because I don't have that slide relatively close, but in the cross section that we drew through Magic Dam, in the dam tender's residence domestic well, the driller noted a sand layer within the basalts there. And wouldn't you know, it corresponds, the top of that sand layer corresponds perfectly with this top of this water pool in Magic. I think Camas Prairie has been the redheaded stepchild of the research. It's just been so, there's been so little done there, considering. There's just not a lot to work with. There's no regional scale aquifer tests or any tests. There's hardly been any drill holes that have been professionally logged. Almost no borehole geophysical logs, even though so many of those wells were drilled with reverse rotary rigs. The hypotheses of Cler have not been checked out with monitoring wells, especially drilled monitoring wells, which they easily could be. The Camas aquifer system does really even out climate variability to provide a dependable irrigation water supply for the farmers on the prairie that use it. And it, like in the last 4 years that we looked at, the storage is increasing. And that means that there's more storage there for the dry cycles. And the surface water availability is undependable and short-lived based on the precipitation and how the water runs off, because most of the water that goes to Magic Reservoir runs off during a hot spell, or a rain on snow event, or just whether the ground is frozen or not. Those all have a big effect on how this available snow melt gets to Magic. And of course, the senior priority surface water diverters on the Camas Prairie, who have the earliest groundwater rights on the Camas, the most senior, they pretty much divert the entire creek. Their water rights covered that, of course. And so the creek is generally dry up in there after the surface water diversions start. And certainly on years when when it's hot and dry, because you use more water longer, you use to the full extent of your water rights, so there's less water left in the creek to flow to Magic. So my conclusion is that I don't think anybody can show me yet, to my satisfaction, that there's been injury on Camas groundwater pumping to storage in Magic Reservoir. I think the variability of the climate that's been going on since 1912 is the single largest determinant of Magic storage, and that's not to say climate change. I'm talking about just climate variability from year to year. And I'm not discounting climate change. I think that the flows, well, certainly the precipitation in as measured at Fairfield has declined over that period. I won't argue that. Magic fills when groundwater levels at their highest before they start pumping. Can't see any direct hydraulic connection between the groundwater and surface water in any of the hydrographs or the pump tests. And the groundwater pump hasn't prevented the senior surface water diverters on the Camas from getting their full rights. Here's a graph attempting to show that climate variability back to 1913. These are the total annual volumes released to the Big Wood from Magic Reservoir, and it's pretty erratic. It's always been that way. You look at this thing and kind of squint your eyes, you don't see a lot of difference. You do see this pretty dramatic decline, I would say, maybe 5 inches over this period in precipitation as measured at the Fairfield Ranger Station. So it's always a combo, right? So I've got a few recommendations meant for my clients. I think we should commence some studies in the Camas. We outlined some, that is the groundwater group, in 2018. And I think we should construct and measure specially designed long-term designated monitoring wells at key locations. That's how we'll solve this issue. And I think that we can get to the bottom of the source of the flows in Lower Willow and Camas Creeks during low flow months. And I'd sure like to do some experiments and a little bit more investigation on that pool that's left in Magic Reservoir in drought years. And I think that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.